This guy crash landed this airplane and everyone survived. However, soon after he was put under investigation. This is why. We start off seeing a plane flying. Okay, more like crashing, but thankfully it was only a dream. But to the pilot, Captain Sullenberger, Sully for short, that was dreaming, so that's not exactly a good sign. He wakes up and goes jogging. You can tell from his face that he's still terrified. He even nearly gets hit by a cab during his run. Now he's back home and he's just sitting in his bathroom while everywhere is covered in steam. Is this a bathroom or a sauna? I'm too broke to know. Forgive me. Today's video is brought to you by the Ridge Wallet. So small it makes everything else look big. The Ridge Wallet holds up to 12 cards plus room for cash. There's over 30 colors and styles including carbon fiber and burnt titanium. The wallets have over 50,000 5-star reviews. In fact, the Ridge team is so confident that you'll like it that they'll let you test drive it for 99 days. You can send it back for a full refund if you don't love it. Get the best offer with ridge.com/minute and you can save up to 40% through December 22nd, but only if you click right now. Check the description for the link. As he's dressing up, the news on the TV is about a plane crash which had no fatalities. Everyone is thanking the captain, which is him, but he just turns off the TV. He heads off to his meeting, which is actually an investigation into the crash. Oh no, a water landing. Sully insists it wasn't a crash. It was a forced water landing on the Hudson. He says they knew exactly what they were trying to execute. The men on the other side of the table start hitting him with questions and he's answering each of them pretty curtly. He says there was no time to calculate any parameters. He just relied on his experience flying thousands of flights over 4 decades to save all the passengers. He realized the best chance the passengers had was on that route, and he bet his life on it. As far as I'm concerned, this guy's a hero. 0 fatalities, you know. But then why are you questioning him for? I guess it's protocol, right? So they keep the questions coming and tell him investigations will continue, and a computer simulation will be done. They keep going on about aircraft jargon that I can't pretend to really understand, but they finally come down to my level and ask him how much sleep he had the night before. He says 8 hours. They ask him if it's possible his blood sugar was low. He says no. They then ask him and his partner when they last had alcohol or substances, but they're clear. His co-pilot, Jeff, has never even tasted a drink. Seeing as they're all clear, the men now ask Captain Sully if he has any problems at home. He says no more than anyone else, and nothing that affected my work. Well, that's all for the interview for now. We see Sully and Jeff in a car with another man. Jeff asks why they're looking for something they did wrong when it turned out all right. Then this man sitting at the back with Sully tells them it didn't turn out right for the airline and the insurance company, so they should expect some blowback. Sully thinks the investigators are just doing their job though. The driver butts in and tells Sully it's an honor driving him today. Then Jeff jokes about bringing the driver in as a character witness. Jeff's got jokes. Now Sully makes a call to his wife, Lorraine, just as he arrives at his hotel. The line starts breaking up, so she asks him to call back. Meanwhile, there's a swarm of press people at his home, where his wife and his daughters are, and by his car where he is right now. He gets in his room and gets on a call with his wife again. It's just normal couple chit-chat happening, which I can't relate to because I've been single my whole life. Then Sully tells his wife that he'll have to be at the hotel longer because of the investigation. He assures her he did the best he could, and she says of course he did. He saved everyone. I know, right? Anyway, Sully is tired and overwhelmed by all the attention, so he asks that they talk in the morning. But before he drops the call, he asks Lorraine what he's going to say when he's interviewed on TV tomorrow. She asks if he needs her to come be with him, but he says no need. The girls need her. They say their I love yous, and they hang up. Moments later, we see him being woken up by a reporter asking if he's a hero or a fraud. But it's all in his head really because the TV is off. Sully, I think you might need to talk to someone. But right now, the person he wants to talk to is his co-pilot. He calls Jeff, who's also awake and pondering why they charge $5 for a Snicker bar. They quickly meet outside and are talking as they take a walk. During this conversation, Sully finds out that they're scheduled to be on David Letterman. He then says he's having trouble separating reality from whatever the hell this is. Then Jeff stops and assures Sully that he did a great thing that will be remembered for a very long time. They'll even make a movie about it. Sully replies, that's the funny thing. I've delivered 1 million passengers over 40 years in the air, but in the end I'm going to be judged on 208 seconds. Girls always judge me by my 30 seconds. Anyway, Jeff tells him to shake it off and tomorrow will be a good day. So they run off because it's freezing out here. The next day, Sully is on TV being interviewed, and he says he doesn't feel like a hero. He says flying has been his whole life. He's been flying for 42 years. Then we quickly see a throwback of Sully when he started flying. The older man who's teaching him tells him, never forget, no matter what's happening, to fly the plane. Then he tells Sully to smile. Back to the present, and a lady is doing some touch-ups on Sully's face. Once she finishes, she plants a kiss on his face and says it was for her mom, Brenda. Brenda is saying thank you and also saying that she's single. But of course, Sully tells her he's married. A good man. He now walks to the window and he's picturing a plane flying at the buildings and he gets lost in his thoughts. So lost that he couldn't hear his colleague calling out his name from across the room. He finally hears his name being called out and his friend is giving him updates. Most of it is basic stuff, but then he tells Sully that they found out that the left engine was still operating at idle. Sully says it's not possible. He felt it go. It's like they were stopped in midair. Sully now heads out and makes into the car through the swarm of press people, and then to another phase of interrogations, and it seems more heated this time. Jeff tells the interrogators to their face that they're just fishing. He tells them only 2 people know what happened in the cockpit that day, and then he adds that the only reason they're here today is because Sully didn't head back to LaGuardia. He goes on telling them that Sully Sully didn't follow proper procedure, but if he had, they'd all have been dead. Sully now cuts in and says he has a significant accident investigation experience, but they tell him none of that matters. They're only focused on that particular flight which crashed. Sorry, water landed. The woman on the panel, Elizabeth, brings up the thing about the left engine continuing to turn throughout the flight, and Sully just point blank tells her that the data is wrong. Then they go on to tell him that the computer simulation of the flight showed that there was enough altitude and speed after the bird's strike for a successful return to LaGuardia. They say they did 20 simulations, and each time the plane landed at LaGuardia undamaged. At this point, Jeff and Sully are speechless. Then Sully asks to go over the parameters that were used. However, for the actual computer simulations, Elizabeth says they can only release it to him after the investigation is over, because they cannot afford another leak to the press. Then they leave. Jeff and Sully stay back and talk for a bit before Sully leaves. Now we see Jeff, Sully, and 3 air hostesses from the flight on David Letterman. They all seem like they're having a good time, to be fair. Letterman is doing his thing, and they're all just laughing. Now we see Sully in his room giving his wife the updates over the phone, and what she's bothered about is if they're paying him for all this media stuff because they got another notice about one of their properties. She's worried they'll lose it. Sully assures that they'll find a way, and she apologizes for adding to his stress. She says she's just anxious and alone. Relatable. But unfortunately, he can't assure her he'll be back soon because the investigation is still on. Sully now starts doubting himself. He asks, what if I did blow this? If I endangered the lives of all those passengers? Lorraine just tells him to watch the news. He's a hero. And she says everyone will have to get used to it, including the NTSB. But that doesn't help Sully. He just keeps spiraling. He's picturing the worst case scenario now. NTSB lists him as the probable cause, and that would mean immediate retirement without pension. All his life work gone. Lorraine is getting scared by his rambling, so he brings her up to date with everything about the simulations and all that. While they're still on the call, Sully drifts off. He's thinking back to before he got on the plane. He first goes to get a tuna basil and he makes small talk with the vendor. Then he gets into the plane. He and Jeff go through the check, and then we see some 2 guys with their dad running to catch the flight. They're super late, but they make it. Anyway, they go through the normal pre-flying protocol, and then the plane starts taking off. While they're in the air, Sully comments on the nice view of the Hudson and says he'll never get over it. Then just moments later, the birds strike, and then things start going wrong. Lights go off, then come back on. Sully immediately calls Mayday and reports that they've lost thrust on both engines and they'll be returning to LaGuardia. The guys at air traffic control are making calls to make an emergency landing happen. Then Sully announces to the passengers to brace for impact. The air hostesses echo brace and instruct the passengers to keep their heads down. The guys back at traffic control are trying to find a runway for emergency landing, but Sully is no longer replying. They want to call it off, but this guy, Patrick, insists he'll stay on it. He calls another aircraft that has eyes on the plane and is communicating with them. They tell him the plane Sully is flying is heading straight for the water, and Patrick is immediately scared. He says people don't survive water landings. Then we cut to Sully and Jeff just as the plane hits the water, and we're immediately back to the present. Sully on the phone with Lorraine. He says he has to go. Lorraine tells him she loves him, but he just repeats that he has to go. He then goes out for a run. He's hearing voices in his head. Most of it is from the investigation. He then gets somewhere and stops. He sees a plane and it takes him back to when he was flying that exact plane and made a difficult landing. His partner in the other plane didn't believe he could do it. Sully now snaps back to reality and runs to a bar. And of course, they recognize him. But not only do they recognize him, they now idolize him. The bartender says he even made a drink after him, so he gives Sully a shot of the Sully. The men are excited when they see Sully's face pop up on the screen, but Sully doesn't share the same emotion. His face is blank. Next, we see some guys on a ship, then some guys in an office, all looking out their windows at the aircraft heading for the Hudson. Now we get a closer look of the passengers as they're being told to brace for impact. A guy's texting someone, some are praying, another guy's helping a woman with her baby, others are just trembling. Then boom, they hit the water and land on it. Sully comes out of the cockpit and tells all the passengers to evacuate. So the hostesses instruct everyone to put on the life vests available to them and get off through the exits. So everyone starts going out and they stand on the wings of the plane. It's freezing cold out there. You can literally see the passengers shivering. A few of them jump into the water, and you can only imagine how much worse it is for them. The guys in the ship quickly head towards the plane while the cops immediately get on a chopper and straight to rescue mode. Jeff and Sully are the last people to evacuate the plane as they were making sure all the passengers were accounted for. Then the ship arrives and they start getting the passengers on board. Another ship shows up and takes more passengers. The guys in the helicopter now show up to rescue the woman in the water who's nearly drowning. Everybody has been rescued. Well, except for Sully. He's still combing the length and breadth of the plane to make sure no one was left behind. A member of his crew is calling out to him. They have to leave now. Sully then wraps up his checks, goes to grab his jacket and a few other things, then heads out behind Jeff. Then they disconnect the foam from the plane. Next, we see the crew finally being brought aboard the ship. Everyone is so cold, but obviously Sully is the coldest. Not because of the weather, but look how unscathed he looks after saving the lives of nearly 200 people. Ice cold. Immediately he gets on the ship. As soon as he gets on the ship, he calls his wife. Take notes, boys. He tells her he's okay, but she didn't even know her husband's life was under threat the entire time. He tells her to turn on the TV. He tells her he loves her, assures her that he's okay, and tells her to tell the girls that he's fine. Now she turns on the TV and she's stunned. Meanwhile, Sully is just standing and looking over the river like a real-life superhero who just saved the day. The Red Cross, fire department, cops, everybody all together are now getting the survivors, which is all the passengers, remember, off the ship. The moment Sully gets off, the first thing he says is that he needs to know who's hurt and how badly. He's really bothered about the count. He wants to make sure that every one of the 155 people on board are accounted for, so when they come and try to take him to meet the police commissioner, he's not thinking of going. going. Meanwhile, the press people are swarming the place as usual. Sully and Jeff look over the river and Jeff says he's never been so happy to be in New York in his life. Sully doesn't say anything. He just turns around and leaves. But while everybody is celebrating, there's Patrick at traffic control who has since secluded himself. He's been sulking until a colleague comes to tell him about the miracle on the Hudson. Now we see Sully doing a checkup at the hospital. The doctor thinks it's a miracle that he landed on the Hudson and doesn't have a single scratch. While he's still there in the hospital room, a colleague of him comes in with the count. 155. Everybody was accounted for. Sully is elated. Later that night, Sully and the rest of the crew are checked into a hotel. The hotel manager, Evelyn, comes and tells Jeff and Sully that the hotel is dedicated to protecting their privacy, so they should feel free to ask for anything. Sully just wants his uniform dry cleaned overnight, and she's surprised that that's the only thing he's asking for. She says she'll give him the entire hotel if she could, and out of nowhere, she just goes in for a hug. Sully is shocked. He's not used to all this female attention. Anyway, they go in the room and their colleague here unloads the supplies he came with. Clothes, shoes, shaving cream, and all that stuff. Before he leaves, he says, "It's been a while New York had news this good, especially with an airplane." Of course, you know what he's referring to. Then Jeff leaves the room and Sully's attention is caught by a reporter on the TV. That brings him back to the present. The reporter on the TV is talking about him. He just stands up and leaves the bar. He calls Larry and asks for a favor before the CVR, which is in 2 days. He wants to see the simulations before the testimony is complete, because he feels the results will be different with human pilots and not just a computer. He says he'll throw in the towel if the results are different. But this is tight. Larry has only 36 hours to make this happen. Anyway, in the morning, Sully's at the Department of Transportation when he gets a call from his wife just before the hearing. She's panicking. She says she just realized for the first time that there were 150 people on that plane, and he was one of them. She's crying that she almost lost him. Sully tells her he's right here. That's what matters. He says it's almost over. He then takes a few deep breaths and heads into the hearing room. Oh, this is not the small panel anymore. There are loads of people here. This must be intimidating, even for our ice-cold Sigma male superhero pilot, but he's handling it pretty well. They start with today's piloted simulations. Jeff whispers to Sully that the simulations won't change his mind about what happened up there. Sully says it might change theirs. The simulation is being done by human pilots now, and everybody's watching. They land successfully at LaGuardia. Now to the second run, another successful landing, this time at Teterboro. Charles, the main guy in the panel, says they're only mimicking what the computer already told them, and he's looking directly at Sully as he's saying this. Sully now challenges the results. He says the human pilots didn't behave like human beings who are experiencing this for the first time. He points out that immediately after the bird strike, they're turning straight back for the airport just like in the computer simulations. He says in their case, no one warned them that they were going to lose both engines at a lower altitude than any jet in history. He says no one has ever trained for an incident like that. Sully goes on to point out an unrealistic bank angle in the landing at the Teterboro and asks how many times the pilots practiced the maneuver before they pulled it off. He goes on to say he's not questioning the pilots. It's just obvious that they were instructed to head for the airport immediately after the bird strike. He goes on challenging the panel, saying that they allowed no time for decision making and analysis. He tells them that they took out all the humanity from the cockpit in these simulations, and that if they're looking for human error, they need to make it human. He then asks how many practice attempts the pilots who landed at Teterboro had, and Elizabeth reveals it was 17. 17 whole attempts before the simulation we just saw. You guys aren't even playing fair. Elizabeth is even trembling as she says it. Meanwhile, Charles makes a call and then comes back and says that the reaction decision time will be set at 35 seconds. Jeff whispers to Sully that that's not enough time, but Sully says, "We only had 208 seconds in total, so I'll take it." I don't know, I feel like 208 seconds would have been a badass title for this movie. But what do I know about filmmaking, right? Anyway, they redo a simulation with a 35-second delay in the response time. The result? A vindicating crash. That was the LaGuardia simulation, so they tried the next one now. At this point, Jeff already has a smile on his face, and the result is the exact same, a crash. So Sully asks if anybody needs to see more simulations. Silence. Then Jeff says, "Now that we've seen what could have happened, can we listen to what actually did?" Charles says they'll look at the results at a later date, and they now listen to the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder from the flight that day. Everyone puts on their headsets, and as they're listening, we're taken to the aircraft. We can hear every step Sully takes, when he calls Mayday and reports that he has lost both his engines, when he asks Jeff to get out to the QRH, that's the quick reference handbook for the non-pilots, all that stuff. We can also hear Patrick trying to direct him to different runways, and Sully just telling him he doesn't think they can make it to any runway. Sully suggests Teterboro, and Patrick makes the necessary calls, but then the plane starts shouting, "Obstacle, pull up, too low, terrain." It was at that point that he announced to the passengers to brace for impact, and then just focus on landing on the Hudson. The plane's voices are going off right now, but Sully just does his thing. He miraculously lands on the water. End of CVR. Sully says he needs to take a quick break. To be fair, going through that entire occurrence again must be a little traumatizing. He walks out and Jeff joins him. He asks Jeff what he thinks after hearing the CVR. Jeff says nothing. Then Sully tells him he's so proud of him. He puts an arm on his shoulder and says to him, "We did this together. We did our job." Jeff echoes that and they walk off. The men come back into the hall, regain their seats, and the guys on the panel carry on. Charles says that was the first time he has listened to a crash recording with the pilots present. He says it's extraordinary. Jeff tells him that it was no simulation. Elizabeth now says that the left engine has been recovered and they just received an extensive report. A report which does only one thing, prove Sully right. It was completely destroyed, and she makes sure to echo what he told them earlier, that the data was wrong. Sully is a better man than me, cause I would have yelled, "I told you so," so loudly that they would hear me from Mars. Plays it cool though. though, and just nods. Liz then adds that she can say with absolute confidence that after speaking with the rest of the flight crew, bird experts, aviation engineers, running through every scenario and interviewing each player, there is still an X in the result, and that X is Sully. Take him out and everything fails. Sully says he disagrees. It wasn't just him, it was all of them. Jeff, the air hostesses, passengers, air traffic controllers, rescue team, cops, they all did it together. Elizabeth asks Jeff if he has anything to add, anything he'd have done differently if he had to do it again. And he says, yes, I would have done it in July, and everybody laughs, including Elizabeth herself, and me. Fantastic note to end this movie if you ask me. Anyway, that's not all. We have a couple post-credit scenes. We see write-ups about how it took more than 1,200 first responders and 7 ferry boats carrying 130 commuters to rescue the passengers and crew. It took them 24 minutes. Sounds like record time to me. Then we see a slideshow of actual images from the incident. No, don't say crash. It was a water landing. And yes, this was a real-life story. We end on the best note. The actual captain giving a speech to the actual passengers and their family. He says, because of the events of January 15th, 2009, I'm convinced that we will be joined in our hearts and in our minds forever. Moral of the story? Tom Hanks.